Okay, good morning. Can you hear us online?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, let's settle in, everybody. People are still arriving. All right, let me find my screen. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining online. I know it's early. So welcome to the Remote Sensing and Fluxes Upscaling for Real-World Impact Workshop. We're really excited to see you. This workshop took a lot of hands, a lot of heads to organize. So thanks to the organizing committee for setting everything up. And I'm here. My name is Christine. If you've been to an Ameriflux event, then we've met. If we haven't met, I'm glad to meet you today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this place that we're at today. So Berkeley Lab, or Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, if you want to be official, really prides itself as a place where we do team science in really large groups where people can bring in their unique talents. And it's over 90 years old at this point, founded by Ernest Orlando Lawrence, who was a major role in the recent Oppenheimer movie, if you've seen that. He apparently looked like Josh Hartnett. And so our mission is to do science to support national goals. We're bringing science solutions to the world. And someone's unmuted. I'm going to mute you. We love to put together interdisciplinary teams to do cool research. Today, we've got about 4,000 staff. About half of them are scientists. A lot of postdocs and grad students work here. We're right next to UC Berkeley, so there's a lot of collaboration between our campuses. And we've got a lot of companies that come out of our inventions that are made at the lab, and we also have a startup incubator called Cyclotron Road. And so that's a really fun place to work. And, you know, we want to brag a little bit. So we do have some credit, some little slice of credit in 16 Nobel Prizes, also National Medals of Science. And largely, we kind of are an all-round science lab. So we've got 6 big areas going from biosciences, energy technologies, earth and environmental sciences. That's where most of the Ameriflux team works. And then we've got physical sciences, computing. We've got a big supercomputing user facility, and also basic energy sciences. So I think that's it for me, and I'm going to hand it over to Kung.
Thank you, Christine. So hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Kung Yi. I work with Ameriflux Management Project, and we are so happy to host you to our workshop. So this workshop, So this workshop is a part of the activities that is organized by Ameriflux DMIR of Remote Sensing Committee, and in collaboration with NEON and Carbon Dew. So let me introduce our DMIR activity led by Ameriflux DMIR Remote Sensing Working Group. So Ameriflux has set some DMIR over the years. So previously, we started with the DMIR of methane and followed by year of water. And now we are in the year of remote sensing. So the goal of this theme year is to encourage research that combine eddy covariance and remote sensing at all levels. That means from ground level to spaceborne or satellite levels throughout the Ameriflux community. And this upscaling is definitely the topic that both eddy covariance and satellite remote sensing communities are interested in. And some of the DMIR activities we have been leading include the sessions at conferences. So for instance, we have been hosting or organizing sessions at AGU, and this year we are again hosting a session which is called Surface Atmosphere Interactions, Intersections between eddy covariance and remote sensing. So if you're interested in contributing your presentation, yeah, please do. And also, we've been hosting a series of webinar, and right now we are hosting some of the distinguished scientists who contributed significantly in this area, specifically focusing on the intersections between eddy covariance and remote sensing. And also, we have some of the new resources on our AmeriFlux website. So we are right now we are providing some of the table or lookup table you can about the remote sensing product that we think Flux community can take advantage of. And right now we are collaborating with NASA GeoNext team, who is working with geostationary data, which means high frequency data that is compatible with the temporal frequency of eddy covariance. And we are working with this NASA team to provide their data on our website, and that will be coming soon. And we also running an instrument loaner program, and we are currently working on the proposal to purchase some instruments and then provide to AmeriFlux community. And right now we are here for a workshop, and we hope from this workshop, we hope to have some working groups for the coming months or years to work together. And so one of our goals of this workshop is to identify those research goals. So I think Christine is not here. Okay. So I'll pass to Neon team for more details about Neon.
Hey everyone, so my name is David Durden. I'm a research scientist at NEON, and I just wanted to give a brief kind of overview of what NEON is. NEON is a large NSF research facility that's tasked with monitoring ecological change in response to climate change and land use change at a continental scale. We have 81 field sites, 47 terrestrial and 34 aquatic, and we're producing upward of 180 data products, and we're tasked with monitoring for 30 years. Part of the unique aspect of NEON is kind of this standardized co-located measurement techniques across these 81 sites, and we're monitoring both with automated instrumentation as well as taking physical samples in the field with kind of boots on the ground. And then we're also flying each site using an airborne remote sensing platform, which I think fits really well with the kind of overall theme of this workshop. So, and with that, I can pass it to another one of our partners, Carbon Dew.
Hi there in Berkeley and around the globe. My name is Stefan Metzger, and I'm also a workshop committee member here for the scaling workshop. I'm representing the Carbon Dew community of practice. I'm very passionate about mapping atmospheric fluxes back to their geographic sources. You are very passionate about scaling. Together, we're going to have a great workshop, I believe. And briefly about who we are, the Carbon Dew community of practice. Our vision is that direct measurements of greenhouse gas exchanges in and out of the air, such as from eddy flux measurements, can help anchor fair and equitable climate solutions. And our mission is to bring together stakeholders across the entire climate spectrum, both public and private entities, to work towards that vision, that direction. We represent members from over 200 public and private organizations. We're open to join for everyone. So if that resonates with you, come check us out. And here's some example activities. So together with AmeriFlux and other entities, we have sister sessions. Kung already mentioned surface atmosphere interactions. There's also one that focuses on real world impact, which is the one that you see here. So if you're interested in that, we very much welcome your abstract submissions. Fairly recently, maybe probably a half year back at this point, we also contributed to, in terms of feedback, federal strategy to advance greenhouse gas emissions measurement monitoring, and many other activities, including proposal writing, collaboration, and so forth. And with that, I pass on to Kristen.
Yeah, I'm just going to go back to the slide that I popped in without telling anybody. So this is slightly off topic, but it's really exciting stuff happening in AmeriFlux, which is a new webinar series that I wanted all of you to know about. So we've called this series Conflux, which is a word that describes two rivers flowing together. And it's a chance for all of us to learn more about flux and environmental research in conversation with Indigenous partners. So the first two speakers are listed here. We're going to start off later this month with Ryan Emanuel from Duke University. And then we've got Angela Wapachik, who possibly built the first flux tower on tribal land, as far as we know. And so we're excited to hear a little bit about environmental justice from Ryan, and then from Angela about how she kind of engages her tribe in this flux research. And so if you want to join us, you can go to go.lbl.gov/conflux. It's also on our Twitter. I should probably put it on our website if I haven't done so already. And so I hope you'll join for that. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Kong.
Yeah, some of the stuff. Okay, so we are back to the workshop. So the goals of our workshop is to review the current state of flux upscaling science and discuss techniques for integrating remote sensing data with flux tower measurements. And we like to identify application and end products such as precision agriculture, carbon monitoring, and ET mapping. So how we want to apply our science to the real world problems. And we also like to provide learning experience, networking opportunities, and understand community need to shape future working activities. And finally, facilitate collaborations between research communities and industry sectors, including organizing joint meetings and workshops. So with that, we have a link to the resource for everything. So I think you have already received an email about our logistics, but yeah, you can go to this link and you can have access to all the resources. So some of the presentations and breakout materials. So please take a note, or yeah, take the screenshot or photo of this QR code that will lead to the link here. And here's a code of conduct. So this is very important, so please pay attention. So we are convening events and meetings that are welcoming, respectful, inclusive, and collaborative. So here's something we encourage you to do or not to do. So please be respectful and trustworthy, and be direct but professional, be inclusive and welcoming, and acknowledge contributions and celebrate achievements, collaborate and co-create. That's something we encourage you to do. But please don't do personal attacks or derogatory languages or disruptive behavior or harassment, violence, and threats. Those are not permitted here, both on-site or online. So this violation may result in being asked to leave this event or online space either temporarily or for the duration of this workshop. And if you experience or witness this kind of violations, please talk to organizing committee members or email to me, kung.e@lbl.gov. And if there's a life-threatening activities, don't hesitate to call 911. And our workshop is a hybrid, has a hybrid format. So talks and breakout sessions are hybrid. And you can find the Zoom links and breakout documents here. So the same link as I introduced earlier, and this QR code is the same as before. And all participants, whether in person or online attendees, will use the same, not the same, but the Google Doc in the same folder to share your ideas during the breakout sessions. So you'll find out the document label that's virtual or in person, so you can find your a document and yeah, fill in your ideas there. And for virtual attendees, please use the chat for questions and discussion, and or raise your hands during Q&A, and chairs will monitor the chat. So here's the agenda for day one, and basically we'll have some of the talks or presentations from the invited speakers, and then followed by breakout sessions. And we have 4 different sessions today. So from first to third sessions, we'll discuss different scales separately. So we'll start with size scale discussion, followed by landscape or regional scale, and then global scale. And finally, during the session 4, we'll be discussing how we can link or integrate the fluxes across the scales. Okay, so with that, I think we are almost time for the first session. So we'll start our first session with the keynote from Dr. Ankur Desai from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Ankur Desai is a prominent professor who's doing research in atmosphere and environmental sciences, leading various projects. Very well-known Cheese Has 19 or Pecan model, and really a lot of projects. And yeah, we'd like to hear a great, precious insight from Dr. Ankur Desai. So Ankur, are you ready for your presentation?
I'm on my screen, so hopefully you can see it. Good. I'm going to.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Just wanted to get that confirmation. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for letting me kick off the start of your session on scaling at the site scale. I'm Ankur Desai, as you heard. I'm here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm very sad that I can't be there in person, but it was just one of those travel juggling contests that I lost. But I'm happy to be able to participate remotely. And more importantly, there are a few members of my lab, including Emily Mather and Srinath Polari, who are there, our former members, who are there in my lab, who are there in person. And you should talk to them along with my close collaborator, Stefan Metzger, whose work I'll talk a little bit about here. And you'll see some of it in the hands-on later on. They know this stuff better than I do. So I'll just try to get you thinking about this topic, and hopefully this will engage some discussion down the road. So my lab has specialized in scaling of fluxes for as long as I've set up and had an ecometeorology lab. And so I'm really excited to see some of the evolution of these ideas as different groups have thought about different ways. And my title here is Your Site is Not So Special, or Is It? And that's not just to make you, feel bad about your site if you are a site PI. I'm feeling bad about my site because I got struck by lightning last week. And so the other thing I'm doing this week is dealing with recovering a flux tower from half of its instruments dying. So that's not so special. But the thing that I want to point out here is that we often have this assumption in the eddy covariance community that we have selected sites that are homogeneous, that are stationary conditions, that are flat terrain. All of the assumptions of eddy covariance are met, and therefore we can kind of trust a time series of eddy covariance as representative of some scaled flux of whatever you're trying to scale to, whether it's a model grid cell or some sort of experimental treatment or a watershed or a landscape or a stand or a farm. And what I'm hoping to try to convince you is that that is actually more the exception than the norm. And in fact, if we really want to be able to take advantage, especially of next generation remote sensing, and answer questions that are useful for society with eddy covariance, really need to rethink how we do site scale measurements. And that's some of the things I'll present today, including a little bit of the work we've been doing in the lab. But to start, it's useful to think a little bit about, the word scaling itself, right? Can imply a lot of things. This is just a pretty air photo near one of our sites during the Cheesehead field campaign. And you might have in your head different ideas, and it kind of involves, you might be thinking about something about, okay, granule or extent or relationships between things happening at one scale and another. And all of those things are parts of scaling. I think for the purposes of my talk, and maybe for some of the things you're seeing later, I'm going to kind of drill that down to a little bit more specific, right? Which is that scaling for us involves the theories and methods that we can use to translate states, flows, or fluxes, processes and mechanisms from a specified spatial, temporal, or spectral dimension to a different granularity, right? And this is really just a way to think about that a lot of our interests, especially in the flux community, really is how do we take measurements we're making at a variety of locations and make some sense out of what's happening to, say, the carbon or water cycle as a whole over the regions that people care about. And this is just a pretty picture of thinking about scale of the pale blue dot of Earth, as Carl Sagan put it, to the site scale. This is an introduction to a special issue I did on scaling that we had on JGR Biogeosciences last year, scaling land-atmosphere interactions. So lots of good articles in there if you want some additional reading. And it does require, right, thinking sometimes scaling is actually not that hard or scary, right? And it requires understanding what processes we have in the system that are what we might call scale invariant versus scale dependent. Now, I know if you're a mathematician or you think mathematically, these have very specific meanings related to power law relationships. But I just want to think about it from a much more simpler perspective, right? Or if you study turbulence micrometeorology, you know about things like 5-third power laws and all that. That's a scale invariance of turbulence, for example. But really, let's push this back a little bit and think about what we really want to know is the whole, the thing we want to understand at the scale that's relevant for the question we're asking scientifically or policy-wise, the sum of the parts that we can realistically measure, or is it something else? Right, and that's basically it from my perspective. And of course, if you wanted to go deeper, I think this nice paper from Yangji in 2019, it's a review paper that kind of really goes a lot deeper into all the ways we think about scale and measurement, modeling, and visualization. I'm not going to focus on that here, but if you want to kind of get a more formal representation of that, this is a good paper to start. Okay. The other point of this is that scaling, as we think about it, is absolutely essential for Earth system science. And probably in this room, I don't have to convince anybody. But as you know, geophysical, biological, aquatic ocean, and atmospheric processes operate at a broad spectrum of scales, whether you're thinking about microscale eddies and photons and genes, which describe the functioning of the fundamentals of our Earth system, to ocean gyres and global energy balance and biomes, which describe the functions of the whole planet. These are a pretty enormous range of scales. And in fact, it is one of the reasons that Earth system science stands alone as its own discipline, right? Otherwise, we could just be part of physics or chemistry. The scaling is really the crux of what makes this science really challenging, right? Across these different interfaces and across a really wide range of scales. And we can't observe all of them or simulate all of those equally well. and it varies by process. And so we have a whole cottage industry of upscaling and downscaling, which you'll see later on through this workshop. And I'm making up a word here because that's what I like to do. And so I'm kind of call it right scaling, right? Getting to scale that you want to be able to compare and integrate observations, understand interactions between systems, and extrapolate insights. And I think it's important to remember that it's always useful to start easy, because a lot of times scaling is linear and it's pretty straightforward, or there's a well-known power law relationship, and it's also then scale invariant. And really the challenge is to find cases where it's not and understand where that is. And this session you're in right now, and some of the example talks you'll hear from Kevin and Dave and probably in the breakout sessions is really focusing on that site scale. How do we understand the site is actually a measurement of what we think we're measuring? So as an example, I'll use the world's tallest eddy flux tower, which is the Park Falls WLEF USPFA core site. This is not the one struck by lightning, amazingly, but this is a site in northern Wisconsin that by virtue of being very tall, when the measurements are connected to the boundary layer, we have a really large footprint. And that footprint is very mixed. But my PhD advisor, Ken Davis, set this study up in 1996, and I've been PI of it since 2004 or 5. And the really basic crux of this was that if we could measure the whole landscape, we know the landscape is mostly forest. If you ask a global Earth system model, you would say it's a bunch of green slime. It is mixed forest, whatever that is. But you might maybe go a little bit more deeper than that and say, well, okay, lots of models have tiling in multiple landscapes. And we also know that something like a quarter of this landscape is wetlands. It's like, okay, well, maybe is this flux tower equally representative of that landscape? And could we test that? Well, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, 2 additional sites that are now Meriflux core sites, Willow Creek, that's the one that got hit by lightning, and Lost Creek, a beautiful wetland, were set up to be representative forest and wetlands. Nothing all too unusual about them, very representative of upper Northwoods forests and wetlands. And we can ask questions. Well, I can go download the Meriflux openly licensed data sets for each of these and calculate the gap-filled mean annual net ecosystem exchange. And for the forest, we have a sink, like most of the mid-latitude forests that we have in the Meriflux system, negative 290 grams carbon, pretty typical number. It's big, but typical for a regrowing mature forest. And Lost Creek, our wetland, is 50. It's a lot smaller, which makes sense. There's less vegetation, there's more waterlogged soil, there's more methane emissions, etc. But we could ask the same question of our landscape tower, which is supposed to be an equal representation of the 75-25 forest wetland mix. And we ask it, and it says the world is a carbon source. So, and if we try to do a raw, simple upscaling, 80% one, 20% the other, or 75-25, depending who you ask, there is some uncertainty due to land cover. You do not get anywhere near +5, right? You get the closest you get is negative 242. That, of course, is a sad face, or as my 14-year-old would say, this is skibbity. So we're down to thinking about, well, what else could we do? Well, me being naive and foolish said, well, let's just build more towers and partially randomly put them everywhere. And so we built 19 additional flux towers for one summer with the help of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And this is the Cheesehead study that you heard about earlier. And what we did was to kind of be representatively randomly sampling in all directions around our tall tower and say, okay, damn it, if 2 towers isn't enough, maybe 19 is close. And some of our modeling studies suggested that, that 12 would get us there. And so we did that. And this is pretty pictures of lots of sites and lots of mosquitoes and lots of field labor done by a lot of people, including Srinath, who's in the room. And we do this. Here's a paper we published last year in JGR Biogeoscience. And all of this is the summer mean NEE, so this is in per day. Tower is still a source. Forests are all over the place, but they're all generally sinks with one exception, which is a recent clear cut. And the wetlands are also on average sinks, and this does not actually explain anything. And we have worked on this in many different ways. And in fact, I had early papers in 2010 that tried to do top-down, bottom-up comparisons. And we did show that there's a bias in the tall tower footprint in the night versus day. That fixes some of it, We can also do a little bit more of like coming up with land use categories and things like that. And management is a particularly large impact on the forest. Look at this wide range of forest net ecosystem exchange from +5 to -4. And a lot of these forests look pretty much darn the same, but they have very different management histories. When they were cut, what was planted, how it was grown back, what disturbances it's faced in its lifetime. And so these things have really large impacts. And if we do account for those, we can get a lot closer. And these things kind of converge on kind of a medium-sized sink, which actually aligns up with things like top-down inversions, which was pretty exciting. But that's still not the whole story. And the reason we can't just paint by numbers, as we like to say, is that a lot of what we're thinking about is that the numbers are kind of all different. So if I took our wetlands and just interspersed them as an example, each wetland has a different spatial scale. And some of those wetlands may have lateral fluxes. Some of those may have unique hotspots of fluxes because they're small or they're large. Some of them may interact because of their edge effects, which may have very different fluxes than right in the middle. And all these things are going to interact. This isn't a new idea. Here's a paper from 1995, Roni Avasar, right? One of our pioneers in boundary layer meteorology and surface atmosphere interactions, showing that if you take a model with tiled land cover versus kind of the average land cover, and you look at the difference in sensible heat flux as a function of averaging the leaf area index or averaging the roughness or the albedo or stomatal conductance, you get these huge 5 to 90 watts per square meters differences in the average sensible heat flux of the region. We know that scaling here is a nonlinear thing because plants have nonlinear interactions in all of their function. The question is, well, why is it all of a sudden a hot topic? Why are you having a workshop now? So here's a picture of from an aircraft near the tall tower. And part of this is because our observations have changed, right? We are entering an era from remote sensing that is, for example, hyperspatial. Here's 1 centimeter drone imagery of plant canopy height around one of our flux towers, done by Christian Andresen in geography, who's currently setting up a new flux tower in the Arctic thaw ponds. And you can see a wide variety of the colors here represent canopy height. There's lots of structural complexity here. We're entering an era that's hypertemporal. You can talk to Paul Stoy, who's also there in person, and I think you'll get to do a tutorial with him. This is just one of his fun graphics from his website Alive, where they're doing a 5-minute update GPP from geostationary satellite coupled to some machine learning models. And you can see all sorts of really complicated structures that you wouldn't see with a daily repeat polar orbiter or a once every 2 weeks Landsat type satellite. So there's lots of function and variability that's happening at sub-hourly scales. In a world that's hyperspectral. So here's my colleague Phil Townsend and his researcher Ting Zhang. Over Cheesehead, we flew 1 meter hyperspectral airborne imagery of traits, and from of hyperspectral imagery of UV visible near infrared. From that, we can derive things like leaf nitrogen, and you can see this enormous variability based on the coordination between plant reflectivity traits and their function. And this spatial complexity changes with time. This was a fun paper I did to just try to come up with a high resolution land surface temperature product. And this is just a Hofmuller diagram showing day of year versus time. And what you can see here is this is the variance between a high and low resolution product of hourly land surface temperature. And you can see that lighter colors means less deviation, darker colors means more. And there's this changes from summer to fall when you see variation in land surface temperature. Now you might say, okay, well, Ameriflux has a whole bunch of sites, so maybe we can just kind of get away with that because all of this like messiness at the site scale will average out. And when you look at the nice picture on the Ameriflux site and you're like, wow, we have covered the United States and lower Canada, and we're even doing pretty decent in the Amazon, and Barrow for some reason has, more sites than you can count just in walking distance to each other. Why can't we, don't we have enough? And the thing that you have to think about is when you look at it from this perspective, those circles do not represent what those towers are measuring, right? If I go down to the site of my single location in northern Wisconsin where we put out our 19 towers, if I actually ran footprint model climatologies, right, this tells us the airshed of all of the flux measurements over the measurement periods that we made. The red circles are a much better representation of what we see at these sites in this particular location, which doesn't cover the whole domain, even with our 19 towers. And you can see here the blue of the footprint of the very tall tower is, of course, much larger and very different. But even that doesn't cover this 10 by 10 square kilometer box, 10 by 10 kilometer box that we're kind of assuming is a typical grid cell, say in a weather model or an ecosystem model. And these footprints, of course, vary in space and time. So this is a nice animation. My former postdoc, now at NOAA, Brian Butterworth, and colleagues, including Srinath and Stefan, helped with this. And there's a whole kind of question about, well, are those footprints actually seeing the same thing each half hour to the next? And as we are reaching this hyperspectral, hypertemporal, hyperspatial grids and remote sensing, and we are breaking our assumptions of our idea that the eddy flux is representative of some box, right? That it's like some magical chamber flux that we can do over an entire ecosystem. And I think that the reason we're interested in this now is because this is a time to rethink how we calculate and scale eddy fluxes. Right, and to think very concretely and discretely, like in this image from Stefan Metzger, of the flux footprints that we're calculating, both for fluxes and for storage fluxes. So in many cases, we can ignore this, right? So homogeneity, right, is an assumption you get when you select sites, unless you're me, who likes to do flux towers in bad locations. And in many cases, we can. But here, for example, is a site. So I asked Ruchi, who's a PhD student with Phil Townsend, and she's been working on trying to look at plant traits around flux towers, neon sites in particular, and Arctic sites. But she's also working with our cheesehead site. So here's air photo of a site. Looks pretty homogeneous. There's some little differences in the greens. It maybe is kind of pointing out to something. But here's that same trait map, now this time leaf mass per area, and all of the footprints of that tower overlaid. And you start to see some interesting things happening. So ignore the road, that's a whole different story. But there's all sorts of variability in this one trait, even though all of the trees are the same species. And in fact, what Ruchi can show from this very simple analysis that she's now applied to many, many sites, using hyperspectral imagery from NASA and NEON and elsewhere, is that, for example, this one particular trait actually does a really good job of explaining the variability we see in NEE that's independent of like what is the actual NEE of the site itself. And you might have to account for that in some way. In fact, what Ruchi is now working on in her PhD is calculating metrics of biodiversity through spectral diversity. And from that, showing that, for example, we can see differences in site resilience of productivity as a function of spectral diversity seen within and across the footprints. So really cool work that's coming out from her PhD in the next couple of years. We've also seen things that are classic. Paul Stoy had a classic paper on this in 2013, but we also know that variance in things like canopy structure here, canopy height, and the standard deviation of canopy across my cheesehead sites has an impact on things like energy balance closure. More complicated sites have worse energy balance, which means that we can't trust necessarily all our flux measurements because they may be low biased. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem as more people want to use flux towers for things like water management. And House and Shu, of course, had a classic paper in 2021 that showed that like virtually every flux tower out there is not fully representative of the thing they say on their IGPP land cover that their flux tower is supposed to represent when you actually run footprint models at all these sites. So to kind of wrap this up, the thing that I've been working on closely with Stefan Metzger has been really thinking about, well, what if we re-envisioned what we could do? What if we could take advantage of the fact that this footprint varies in time and that looks at slightly different things at each time? And if we had remote sensing that told us what is that slightly different thing at each time and how that varies in space and time, could we actually maybe come up with a new way to calculate fluxes? And this is the work that Stefan did in his PhD work in a paper in 2013, and then my former PhD student Ke Xu kind of extended to towers in collaboration, and really this idea of using flux towers and their footprint variability and using high frequency decomposition of fluxes down to 5-minute fluxes and 5-minute flux footprint intervals and hyperspectral imagery and high resolution things, and even using things like flux aircraft, we can actually create time-space resolved max fluxes. And this is work that takes advantage of the fact that even though over the course of 1 hour, so here's sensible heat flux calculated every 5 minutes over 1 hour using a wavelet type approach, that we are looking at slightly different landscapes. So the color here represents enhanced vegetation index, and it varies from the beginning of this hour to the end of the hour. And we might be able to take advantage of that information to say, oh, look, sensible heat flux is higher at the beginning of the hour than it is at the end of the hour. Maybe that's actually representative of landscape variability. Same with CO2. And so this is the work that's been being pushed in recent new NSF project that I have, with Stefan and others are really thinking about fluxes as a mapping tool, right? And how do we go from kind of our footprint? So here's in Atmofax, Stefan's new company. He's kind of have this little fun animation showing how that you might imagine how could we get to this on the right from what we've traditionally done on the left if we really want to scale fluxes properly, and especially for detecting things like hotspots or treatments or differences. One of the things we found even in early work from CUS that even if you just looked at the statistical distribution, if you wanted to get the mean flux from the tower versus what we get from the entire grid after we do this reprojection, we get a very different answer. And look at this. Here at my tall tower, we suddenly start to see much more probability of much lower fluxes, more in line with all those forest flux towers. So maybe we're starting to right scale this. And we can do things like upscale with this. And I have 1 more minute of slides and I'll quit. And here's work from Susie Wiesner, who is an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin, River Falls, but formerly was a postdoc with Paul Stoy and I, working at a dairy farm where she applied Stefan's algorithms to an individual flux tower and used that to calibrate a much larger scale remote sensing model from Landsat to estimate this particular mixed dairy forage and pasture and forest landscape, and what is the net carbon uptake of this entire system, which we should then able to show is actually nearly balancing out all of the inputs and outputs going into the production of dairy. And of course, we're in a world where lots and lots of interest right now in nature-based climate solutions and carbon emissions reductions and using flux towers. And of course, lots of pushback, for example, in The Guardian, showing that lots of carbon offsets are junks. We're not measuring them well. There's lots of work in carbon protocols that are out there, but none of them really use flux towers currently. And of course, the Biden administration just put out in May this particularly important report on voluntary carbon market statement and principles. And one of those is that the emissions reductions and removals have to be real and quantifiable. Is there a role for eddy covariance to actually maybe be part of the solution to kind of resurrecting and actually supporting? Because there is no climate emissions reduction scenario in the IPCC that does not have some significant amount of nature-based climate removal, bioenergy and carbon capture, and carbon dioxide removals. And we need to be able to measure those if we're actually going to have a useful climate policy globally. And there's lots and lots of different types of these going on in the IPCC. So the final slide, some questions to ponder. Can we develop community tools for properly down, up, right scaling individual site tower fluxes in a world of hyper everything remote sensing? That I think is a question I hope you can all discuss in your various talks and breakouts and tutorials today and tomorrow. Can we gain information from additional plot level measurements and rectify biases at tower? And how might this information gain, as I'm saying, basically getting more information from the same measurements, lead to better evaluation of our system models, quantification of these nature-based climate solutions, and decision-making around ecosystem resource management, the things that we're getting lots of phone calls left and right from everything from farmers to investment bankers who want to be able to use flux towers to understand how their system is changing and understanding how these carbon credits are actually being accounted. So thank you for everyone. Lots and lots of people contributed to lots and lots of things in this talk. I want to, of course, commend the Department of Energy Ameriflux Network Management Project for supporting our Cheese core site cluster over the years, as well as support from NSF and NOAA for various projects. And you know where to find me on email, web, or Twitter. So thanks.
Thank you, Anchor. So just a note that we will have Q&A after all 3 talks. So we'll just go ahead and, introduce our next speaker, David Durden from NEON, and he'll be talking about introducing some of the mission with airplane, that is conducted in NEON.
All right. Thanks for bearing with me, getting everything going and getting this up on the Zoom as well. So my talk is titled From the Plot to the Plane, Neon's Integrated Scaled Design. And I kind of gave a little brief introduction to what Neon is earlier, but it's a continental scale observatory that's tasked with monitoring ecological change for 30 years. It's built to enable analysis with free and open data and samples on the drivers and responses to environmental change. It's also meant to enable comparison by providing a reliable framework with standardized protocols and data collection methodology used across the observatory. And lastly, it's meant to facilitate interoperability, so allowing our measurements to be utilized with other networks and other researchers who want to use NEON data to facilitate their research. So I provided this figure here just to kind of give an idea of the scale of NEON. This is, we call it NEON by the numbers. We provide data from 34 aquatic sites and 47 terrestrial sites that are spread across the continental US, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. The observatory is separated into 20 different ecoclimatic domains. And on average each year, we're now collecting samples from about 100,000 plus samples each year. And to date, we're over 500,000 samples. In total, we provide 180 plus data products, and that's across the different observational platforms. So thinking about the instrumented systems, both terrestrial and aquatic, the observational sampling that's going on both in aquatic and terrestrial environments. And now we've been kind of growing in our ability to facilitate research. To date, there are over 900 publications that are utilizing NEON data or tools. So going back to the formation of NEON, so back in 2003, the National Research Council provided this central goal of NEON. So I'll just kind of quote here. The central goal of NEON should be to perform comprehensive regional to continental scale experimental and observational research on the nation's natural and managed ecosystems to obtain an in-depth understanding of environment in order to assess vulnerability and resilience of ecosystems to environmental change. And as we can see, that's still a problem today. Just last year, the 6th assessment report came out from the IPCC. And it points to us still needing a better understanding of how our ecosystems are going to change as climate continues to change and land use continues to change. So you want to build an observatory. You start out with this kind of grand idea of what that would be, right? You want to measure it at the site scale and make sure that it can be scaled to the region using satellite observations. And then having this network of sites will allow us to make inferences at the continental to global scale. But then when you dive into it, what does that mean at the site scale? What do you have to do from a measurement perspective to enable these scaling to occur? So here we have a kind of conceptual figure with the flux tower at the center. And then we have the solar arrays going off into the main wind direction. We have people in the field actually making observational samples within this area of what we call mutual representativeness. So those samples that we're taking are kind of representative of what we're measuring at the flux tower and what we're getting with our airborne observation platform. And then you start thinking, okay, we still need to link in those aquatic environments. So measuring similar variables across mediums. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into this. And I thought that this figure right here was kind of a nice way of saying, scale really matters in all we do, right? The kid drew a picture of the table that's under the microscope, and I mean, he's not wrong, right? So when going to think about addressing these questions of scale, and when I came up with the plot title, From the Plot to the Plane, this figure from very early neon research materials kind of came to mind, where you have these processes that are happening at a very wide range of spatiotemporal scales, from the leaf level all the way up to the continental scale, and we're measuring like some of these activity at areas across this continuum to try to understand processes that are occurring by being able to evaluate these processes at different scales. So when I started thinking about, okay, so what all went into this, I think we can optimize the observational design. So working on the observing system design, and then we have scaling techniques once we have our data. And so I kind of listed some of my thoughts here. So one being optimizing the spatial representativeness of our data. So meaning we're measuring across various ecoclimatic domains. We're ensuring that we're monitoring representative ecosystems. And then we're making sure that we have a proper site and measurement density. So thinking about, are we accurately measuring to be able to make these inferences across different scales? Second, we have to take into account uncertainty. So we need to make sure that our data of a certain quality and that we're quantifying uncertainty so that they can be compared across sites and across observatories. So that takes into account things like site selection and design and calibration and maintenance and QA/QC. And then when we think about scaling techniques, we can think about data-driven techniques or process-based techniques such as modeling. And then there's this whole emerging field of kind of data fusion and machine learning that's kind of broadening our horizons of what we can do. So I'll kind of follow along on those kind of ideas, and starting with the observational design. So why 20 domains? So in 2004, Hargrove and Hoffman came up with this paper that discussed this idea of delineation of ecoregions. And you can see that as it approached 20, we started to get a sufficient amount of explanatory power for the kind of ecoclimatic variability that we see across the continental US. Going above that kind of would have been a limited return on investment. So if we look at this kind of ecoclimatic domain, so this is a picture of neon and how it's delineated based off of that Hargrove and Hoffman paper. And then we overlay active Ameriflux sites. And then we add in the kind of neon sites on top of that. We see that we're covering some areas that maybe weren't completely sampled previously up here in the kind of northwest region of the US, providing us some additional information, and looking at it from this point of view helps us understand where we might be missing some ecoclimatic variability and where we're monitoring. Additionally, in 2017, Mahecha et al. Came up with this paper that looked at the ability of observational networks to detect extreme events, hydrologic extreme events. And you can see here that at an extreme rank of 50, how many of the number of events that would have been detected by Ameriflux would have been around 45. And then neon with 39 sites would have detected around 30% of that. So, and if you bring Ameriflux and neon together, you can see that we can detect even more extreme events. But part of that also has to take into account where we're measuring. So thinking about, are we capturing a sufficient diversity of the climate copings or the vegetation the IGBP, excuse me, to ensure that we can use some of these scaling techniques up to the continental scale. So then taking you from that conceptual point of view over here on the left, where we had the tower, the observations, both in the terrestrial and the aquatic, to what that looks like at the site scale. You can see a picture here on the right of our Niwot Ridge site, where we have our tower and then our solar arrays going off into the main wind direction. And as we've talked about, we're being able to monitor these ecosystems in a standardized way kind of really empowers us to make these connections at larger scales. And as you can see from this picture in the top right from Novick et al., NEON is one of the most standardized observatories there is, with a very kind of top-down approach. And that top-down approach allows us to kind of build these systems, such as a data quality system, which you can kind of see outlined here on the right, where everything from the instrumentation to the field science staff that are out maintaining the equipment or taking the samples in the field, to when the data are on the data portal and somebody observes an issue in the data, all that filters into this kind of centralized issue management framework that allows us to address those issues and try to improve on our data quality, which you can see on the left here has been improving since our inception. We went into formal operations around 2018, and you can see that we've improved our data completeness and data validity as we've went forward in time. Additionally, that means making sure that we're checking ourselves against other observatories. So recently we had the Ameriflux team come out and they deployed their portable eddy covariance system to kind of do a comparison against our Kanza site and help us ensure that the way that we're collecting the data and processing the data is meeting community standards. So now shifting gears from where we were thinking about observatory design to now thinking about scaling methodology. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about data model integration and two projects that I'm working on that are kind of helping address this. One is the in-car NEON modeling framework, where we're taking NEON data and gap filling those and providing them to a containerized version of in-car's community land model. And we've built some great kind of tools to allow us to evaluate the data versus the modeled fluxes. And this has helped us improve overall our data product quality. In addition, helped us to kind of understand better the parameterizations in the model and the processes that it's trying to mimic. Additionally, I've been working to help the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, RCN. So they're doing a challenge where people can submit their forecasts for NEON fluxes, or I think there's 5 total challenges, and fluxes is one of them. So people can submit their forecast for the fluxes, and then it's evaluated the next month when that data comes into NEON. So this, I think, there is a really interesting way for us to kind of move science forward and start looking into forecasting what the future holds at some of these sites. Next, I'll talk a little bit about a different scaling methodology of data fusion. So we have all these disparate data sources from the fluxes and the field observations at the site to the airborne remote sensing. And then we can bring in data from satellite remote sensing or regional reanalysis. And we can use that to provide us a more in-depth understanding of the environmental response functions that we see across the landscape, and allows us to create a more detailed picture of what's going on across these landscape scales. And hopefully this scaled product can be used to inform models and better understand those processes that we're trying to capture in those as well. So when I think about what can we do to kind of address the scale gaps, I I think about new measurement technologies, such as looking at what UAS or uncrewed aerial systems can bring. And we've done some pilot studies with that at NEON sites and comparing against our airborne observation platform. And then I think about collaboration and partnerships. So we began, our history with Ameriflux with our first white paper in 2016, and we've come a long ways since then. And we're adding to that history today with this workshop. And lastly, we're also working together with other networks across the globe in the Global Ecosystem Research Infrastructure, RCN, to kind of help make sure that our data are interoperable and can be used to address these questions of scale, even at the global scale. So I'll leave you with this. At NEON, we like to say that good science is built on good data. But I also like to add that good data and creativity. And I think at workshops like this, where we have the opportunity to come together and work and exchange ideas, is one of those kind of vehicles for us to kind of improve our creativity and how we can utilize these data for societal benefits. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. Next up is Carolina Lisboa from Vera, and she'll be talking about harnessing remote sensing and flux measurement for verified carbon standard and agricultural land management methodologies.
Hello, thank you. I asked for someone to share the slides, and
Working on it.
yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so let's get started then. So good morning to everyone. I just want to start by thanking the organizers for the invitation, and also for make some special arrangements that I could participate in, since I'm based in Germany. I also want to say that Vera is very grateful for the opportunity to share the insights into our work, developing methodology for the carbon market. So lastly, my name is Carolina Lisboa. So I'm a manager on the agriculture innovation team at Vera. Most of the work of our team is supporting and reviewing the VCS ag-related methodologies and looking for new opportunities for the agricultural sector into the carbon market. We are a very small team of 4 people, and we work in collaboration with other teams across the organization, including the forest team, which I think it's also, they develop such a work that the people here would be interested also to learn about it. So the title today of my presentation is this very long and beautiful title, Harnessing the Remote Sense and Flux Measurements for the Verified Carbon Standards and Agricultural Land Management Methodologies. Next slide, please. So the topic of the agenda today, we're going to start with a very short overview of Vera and the Verified Carbon Standard. And then we're going to move to the VCS agricultural methodologies. And I will close with sharing with you some updates about innovations in Vera and the challenges we are facing. Next slide, please. So if you don't know yet much about Vera, Vera is a nonprofit organization founded in 2007. Vera is setting up standards that enable credible, transparent, and robust quantification for the environment impacts and also social impact for climate change mitigation and the other environmental projects. Vera has developed and operated several global standards. This you can see here on the left bottom of this slide. And these standards can be used to certify that projects achieve measurable high integrity outcomes. And also, Vera is currently developing new standards framework, such as the Scope 3 program, which will unlock immediate and large-scale investments in the supply chain climate. So the VCS standard program is the Vera flagship program. The VCS is the world's largest voluntary GHG reduction accreditation program. So now we have more than 1.2 billion projects registered, 2.100,000 projects registered in 95 countries, accounting for 80% of the total voluntary carbon market transactions. And these projects has generated more than 1.2 billion carbon credits. These projects usually deliver other benefits, such as access to health service and the other social service. And estimates it has indicated that the demand for carbon credits could increase 15 times more by 2030 and up to 100 times more by 2050. That would make the carbon credit markets worth over 50 billion by 2030. So last, I just want to flag here that the VCS has won two of the most prestigious awards, the environmental finance, for example, for a number of years, as you can see here on the bottom right. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the VCS ag methodologies and the current opportunities to credit agricultural emission reduction and removal for activities under the VCS. Next slide, please. Until now, we have these four methodologies for the agricultural sector covering different project types and sectorial scopes. Our flagship methodology is the VM42 and the accompanying module VMD53 for model calibration. These methodologies cover projects activities that promote sustainable land management practices and anything that can increase carbon stocks on the land and decrease GHG emissions. The next one is the VM32, which is a methodology that serves grassland projects. It quantifies GHG emission reductions and removals for sustainable grassland management activities, such as adjusting of grazing animals, but it also includes manipulating the number and the type of domestic livestock grazing animals or grouping them, timing or ceasing the grazing. This is a very important methodology. This methodology also allows altering the frequency and intensity of prescribed fire into an uncultivated grassland landscape with the focus of increasing soil organic carbon stocks and reduce methane emissions. The next methodology is the VM41. This methodology estimates enteric methane emissions reductions generated from the inhibitors of methanogenesis due to the introduction of natural feeding supplements to the ruminants' diet. And the last and most recent methodology is the VM44. These methodologies quantify carbon dioxide removals resulting from the conversion of waste biomass into biochar at a new biochar production facility. It is eligible to project activities that focus on soil and no-soil applications, including crops and grasslands, and emerges products such as biochar, amended concrete, and building materials. So here on the right side, you can see a short list of the main characteristics of the ag methodologies. These ag methodologies mainly quantify carbon removals, but they also quantify the reduction emissions of nitrous oxides, methane, and to a less extent CO2 from different sources or pools, such as organic carbon, soil organic carbon. Sorry, I think there, can you move back the slides? Yes. Such as soil organic carbon stocks, wood biomass, above ground and below ground biomass, fertilizer user, enteric fermentation, and machinery in agricultural operations. So the quantification approach of emission reductions and removal of these methodologies are basically using direct measurements. For example, for soil organic carbon, it's dry combustion. And for CH4 flux, we use chamber measurements. It also allows the use of empirical or process-based models, for example, biogeochemical models. And when none of those is possible, you can also use default values from the, for example, IPCC default factors. So, but we know that all these approaches also impose some challenges in terms of cost, time, and reliability. And we know also that recent advances has been made to estimate these variables through remote sensing combination with sophisticated analytical methods. For example, machine learning or artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. With that in mind, I want to say that our standards are not stagnant, and Vera is constantly reviewing aspects of the standards and updating them with new scientific information and through the feedbacks we get from stakeholders. Vera is consistently identifying areas that need updates, releasing public consultation, incorporate public comments, updating our programs and methodologies, and also developing new methodologies and new tools for quantification of greenhouse gas and the emission reductions and removals. We constantly promote new innovation, and we're exploring new work streams, and they stay up to date to the cutting edge research and technology. And in fact, we have a whole team dedicated to the innovations. Next slide, please. So I think this is the most interest for you. Currently, our technology solutions team is building and expanding our capabilities to work with new technologies. Our team is working different work streams, but today I'm just going to focus on the digital MRVs, measurement, reporting, and verification platform. In this slide here, I just want to summarize the different but complementary MRV approaches under the VCS methodologies, some that are already implemented and other under development, or others could be something for the future. To start with, I said already in the beginning about the direct measurements, which is fully operational. We collect active data through surveys or digital data logs from project activities. And they also perform soil sampling and laboratory analysis to quantify soil organic carbon stocks. As I said in the beginning, we measure soil carbon content using dry combustion, and also measurable density. Or you can also use chamber measurements to quantify methane and N2O emissions, fluxes. At a plot level, right? And the next quantification approach that we are currently working and developing and having a better understanding if we can really implement in the methodologies would be the remote sensing, which we hope to collect this activity data using image analysis, for example, satellite analysis. And they also use indirect field measurements of GHG source and carbon pools. For that, I'm going to talk a little bit later. We specifically for the agricultural methodology, we are working on the development of a tool using digital soil maps. And what we expect and have not yet started discussion or accessing in our group is the use of auxiliary measurements. I apologize if I'm using the wrong term here, but we understand as the use of direct and indirect field measurements of the GHG source and pool include the use of sensors on probes. That would be the use of Ecovarius towers in combination of field sensors to use this activity and measurement data that would use to improve the existing model performance, conduct models in the intercomparison, and build a new or multi-model ensemble using artificial intelligence, for example. We hope that with that we can improve the models and can support decisions, support tools to assess project feasibility, project performance, and also the long-term monitoring. As you might know, the agricultural projects under the VCS program, they require a project longevity of 40 years, and you have to prove permanence, ensure permanence of 100 years. Therefore, the long-term monitor is also very important, and I think that is a huge opportunity for this type of measurements to fill that gap there in terms of monitoring. Nonetheless, adopting these technologies, it's really came with big challenge, which I want to talk in my next slide, please. So there are several challenges to implement innovation into our programs and facilitate project implementation. I just list here in big three groups, but I'm sure there are many others there. But so far, we have found challenge in terms of measurement approach or technologies. One which is it's very important for us is quantification of uncertainty, identification of the error source, and also what are the techniques or equations using for standard error propagation. That's very important because this uncertainty it's used to develop further deduction factors, which will be extracted for the whole quantification or the balance of a project. That means if you are using an approach with a large uncertainty, you're going to have a large deduction on your emission reductions and removals. And less credits, less VCs. Another issue is in terms of the certification of the project area and the data that we use to calibrate and validate the use of these approaches, these remote approaches, as well as the equipment costs that to now, apparently it seems still extremely expensive at a project level to handle such equipments, and also the costs related to operation and maintenance needs. The next big one is concerned data availability. What we heard from the stakeholders that they have very limited access to data source, and we would need that this data source would follow the fair data principles. That means they should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And they also should, all of this data base should share the data management plan, which should be accessible and publicly available. And the last big challenge is in terms of organizational infrastructure. We need still to build up this physical structure, and the investment costs are high. In terms of the VCS program, in terms of the project proponent who is actually implementing, execute the projects, and they also for the VVB side, they need to build up their capacity, for example, to validate and verify this data to ensure that the data has been properly used. And they also, the difficulties in terms of the technical and the operation capacity needs. We feel like it's still very niche. We need to build up this capacity to expand and scale up the use of these innovative technologies. Next slide, please. So currently, for the agricultural methodologies, we have two new products that we are working on. One I mentioned at the beginning is this tool for quantify soil organic carbon stocks using digital soil map. This is a third-party to build digital soil maps and quantify soil organic carbon stocks. The next one is the RISE methodology. It is a Vera-led methodology with the collaboration from Atoa Carbon. And this methodology, we really hope that we could use, for example, edge towers to measure methane flux. But we felt like there was not yet a standard protocol for the project developers to enable that they can use these technologies at the project level and collect this information. But although we believe that can improve the quality of the data, but as I said, it's in this case, it's a mix of measurement approach because we don't have a standard protocol, mixed with the organization infrastructure because the market is not very well prepared yet to adopt this kind of approach. And we are also have been discussing within our group the fact that we are not yet using Flux Tower. That does not mean that we are not interested. We have been discussing with several companies and other organizations who is also developing and are interested in work with such technology. But it's still in a very early stage. But we hope that soon we'll be able to pilot at least the implementation of these technologies and adopt them in the future in the VCS methodologies. That's it for me. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to follow up if you have any specific questions about the program or the methodology per se, or how if you are interested in collaborating with Vera, you are all welcome to write me an email and we can exchange some information. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. So this is time for Q&A. We are a little bit behind the schedule, but yeah, we can take about 5 minutes of Q&A. So yeah, please go ahead and ask questions to any speakers from this morning.
Any questions online?
I think we have one from Barbara.
Christine Dennis has his hand up.
Go ahead, Dennis.
You can unmute yourself, Dennis, and
Dennis, if you want to put your question in the chat, we'll let Stefan go in the meantime.
Carolina, can you hear me? Hey.
Hey,
Thanks.
Stefan.
Thanks for your awesome overview talk. I'm curious,
you.
to which extent has Vera been starting to work with Flux Tower or the Flux Tower community? It was on the far right in terms of potentially future technologies. To which extent have you been working in that area already?
Yes, we had like idea note proposal a while ago, but that didn't progress for whatever reason, but was also for work with the forest methodologies. And for the egg methodology, to be honest, just last week, we had a first talk with a group who approached us because they are interested to work with this kind of technologies, but we have just started talk to them. And yes, I mean, it's really like, it's not really anything which is progressing, we're just starting a conversation around it, but definitely we are very interested to learn and to discuss the feasibility of using this technology and what would be the advantage of using that, right?
Thanks, Carolina.
Okay, and then we have a question that Dennis put in the chat, and it's for Ankur. So he says Jackie Hatala tried to upscale their methane fluxes in the wetland with water and veg patches and found that it was a function of the fractal dimension of the patches. Have you looked into this?
Your first mistake is working with methane, but it is certainly the case. I think with a lot of our wetland work, we see in chamber fluxes all the time, there's strong spatial variability and gradients from edge to center. And so it makes sense that things like patch shape would have some impact, and you're absolutely right. There may be some interesting ways to kind of incorporate that into the scaling algorithms that we discussed earlier. So yeah, thanks for that.
Any other questions?
There's one more in the chat.
In the chat. Yeah, in the chat.
I can read it out. Is there a pattern from Eric Ward? Is there a pattern of positioning flux towers away from sources of fossil fuel combustion, other human-driven emissions that might affect scaling? In case of tall tower, airborne measurements, are we picking up sources at larger scales we might miss at smaller ones? Yeah, that is a concern. And, there's kind of the rules of thumb. For example, our generator-driven sites, we often put the generators at pretty far distance in the upwind, in the downwind distance, so that we don't frequently get that in the footprint. With the tall tower, we've done stuff with isotopic measurements, partly because it is a NOAA greenhouse gas site. So we also have really good well characterization of the CO2 air mass. And so we can see, for example, when the paper mill was operating to the northwest, there was some biomass burning type related signatures, and you could potentially do that. In principle, the flux mapping type of approaches that I discussed are and you can ask Stefan about this, are reasonably good also at very much pinpointing point type sources. And that there may be some help with citing using those types of approaches to further think about where to put flux towers.
Yeah, I think we can move on to the. Okay, yeah, thanks, Anchor and Carolina and David for great talks. Okay, Robert, if you have questions.
That way everybody can hear you also online.
Hi, so my name is Robert, and this question is for David, actually, about the NEON network. And so you mentioned that it's a 30-year sort of mandate that it stretches all across North America and this continent. And it's very standardized within that continent. But I know there are other networks like it, like ICOS or maybe even SEON in South Africa or other smaller regional networks. And I'm curious if you know to the extent which you're compatible with those and continue to be standardized across that barrier for global synthesis, and if that's part of the mandate and if that's explicitly considered, or if it's really just an American-centric game plan.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I touched on it briefly, but the GEARI Research Collaboration Network is really trying to address that question and make sure that we are making our data comparable across networks, and sharing ideas on protocols and data collection methods. Additionally, we've been working pretty closely with ICOS on a intercomparison study, and also just running our data through their pipeline, for instance. And vice versa, they're sending their data to us to process as well, to kind of tease out areas of uncertainty in the way that we're, processing the data, collecting the data, and see if we can determine, if there are differences, where are those uncertainties coming from? So.
My name is Michael Schopenhauer. One question on the Neon side, or generally speaking about the whole thing. I think we have two very different buckets here. We have the Neon sites, which are focusing on rather homogeneous, well, not really homogeneous, but somewhat consistent ecosystems. But on the other side, we have the agro ecosystems, which are highly dynamic. And as your own statistics showed, you have one tower and on a crop system, and even that one isn't really on a specific crop system. It's in an environment where there are crop systems, but it's not looking at specific crops. If you contrast that to the amount of land that in this country we're using for agriculture versus the other ecosystems that you're looking at, then it's half and half, which means you're completely overexposed to like forest systems and permanent something, whereas the highly dynamic and highly influential, in particular for the really critical greenhouse gases that you're not monitoring, which is nitrous oxide and methane to some degree, which is still a major component, you're not at all exposed, you're not measuring and all that. And I understand that the NEON mission as to what you put out is a very different one. But when we're talking Vera and we're talking about carbon sequestration, when we're talking about greenhouse warming, that's an entirely different question from what you're looking at NEON. And I'd almost say that NEON may be able to provide a baseline of something, but basically is unhelpful in terms of how do we actually manage ecosystems in order to affect change. It's an entirely different question, and we don't really have any tools. I mean, NEON doesn't have any tools to measure any of that. So we're completely flying blind in that entire direction there.
Your response to that? There you go.
Hey, thanks. Really appreciate this discussion and also the points about, you're measuring something that is not the specific managed project you need to know about. But I just want to push back on the concept that there's little information in Neon or Ameriflux or Flux Network data in general that can be brought to bear on these projects because, okay, Neon, right. That's true. Yes. Yes. For sure. And obviously more measurements of those systems or system types would be beneficial within Neon or other organizations or agencies. For sure. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They don't hear him anymore.
Okay. I think we can still, start discussion.
Right. So you're referencing specifically agricultural systems within this whole market of many, many different project types.
So sorry to interrupt, but we are kind of a bit behind the schedule. So let's take it to a coffee break later. And let's move on to the breakout session.
Hello, everyone. We start with session 2 now. Please be seated. So the next session will focus on landscape and regional related studies. And our first speaker is Troy Magny from UC Davis. And he will present his talk titled Scaling Evergreen Forest Photosynthesis from Needle to the Tower to Space. Magny, your stage.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. It's good to come down from 110-degree Sacramento for the day. Yeah, so I know this session is focused on the regional scale, but from what I understood, it was landscape and regional. So I'm going to mostly just go to the landscape scale, but I'll talk about the regional scale. And I thought I'd talk about evergreen forests today because we do a lot of work in evergreen forests, and I think they're cool and interesting. Okay, so this goes without saying, but photosynthesis is at the heart of ecosystem function and many of the ways that we evaluate ecosystem health, and especially with regards to carbon cycle and carbon storage. If we're trying to answer these bigger questions about how have and will evergreen forests change into the future, and what are the biotic and abiotic controls of canopy and needle scale photosynthesis, we really need to understand how we can measure and create uncertainties and ultimately scale estimates of photosynthesis across space and time. And so today I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing, really from the needle to the tower up to the landscape scale. So this goes without saying, but evergreen needle leaf forests are important. They cover a broad swath of the globe, and as a stress physiologist, I think they're one of the more interesting ecosystems to focus on. Of course, with climate change, we've observed in the northern high latitudes patterns of widespread greening, longer growing seasons, and then climate change related threats from insects and diseases, and also fire. And photosynthesis really is at the heart of a lot of these changes. And if we can figure out appropriate ways to scale and quantify the timing and magnitude of CO2 uptake, we can get a better understanding of the fate of these systems. But it's quite challenging to do, and I'm going to get a little physiology heavy on you today, but really, in order to scale these things properly, it requires a nuanced understanding of both the light and the carbon reactions of photosynthesis. After all, with remote sensing and optical techniques, all we can really see is the light reactions, but we know that there is some decoupling between the light and the carbon reactions of photosynthesis, and it's important to sort of take this into account. And I won't get super into it, but I wrote a little opinion piece about it a few years ago. So at the leaf and needle scale, we can quantify evergreen needle leaf photosynthetic parameters using things like pigment analysis, needle scale gas exchange measurements, and continuous PAM fluorimetry measurements, where we basically hook up, and I'll show some data from this, where we hook up what's called a fluorimeter that sends pulses of light at the needle, and it enables us to better understand what exactly the needles are doing with that light. Then, of course, we can scale this up to the scale we will be talking about a lot during this workshop, the eddy covariance scale. However, I'm sure some variation of this map will be shown about 500 times over the next 2 days. But as we know, flux towers are limited spatially, so we need to figure out ways to scale those. And a lot of the work we do in my group is put tower-based remote sensing instruments on top of flux towers so we can better understand that mechanistic link between reflectance across the reflectance spectrum, but also in the Fraunhofer lines using the solar-induced fluorescence technique, and link that directly with eddy covariance fluxes within the footprint. So what I'm talking about today is some work we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years, where we sort of test this scaling approach across 4 sites scattered across a latitudinal gradient. 2 of these sites are NEON sites, Ordway Swisher down in Florida and Delta Junction up in Alaska. And what I want to focus on is the biological basis for using these optical signals to track evergreen needle leaf photosynthesis. So I'll start by talking about needle scale mechanisms, and then I'll scale up to the canopy. And then I'll touch very briefly on how satellites and global scale remote sensing can begin to infer gross primary productivity in these systems and make the argument that I think everyone here can probably agree with, that these multi-scale observations are absolutely necessary. So let's start with the needle scale. So here we've got our cartoon tree here. It's being hit with some light. We all know that environmental conditions are going to regulate how much of that light can be used to drive photosynthesis. And the interesting thing from a physiology perspective and from a remote sensing perspective is that evergreen species retain their chlorophyll year-round, so they're green all the time. So this makes it a little more challenging from a remote sensing perspective to see what's going on. But we can use both information on plant pigments and what plants are doing with that light to better understand how active they are. And so there's a few fates when a photon reaches a needle or a leaf surface and enters the photosystem. There's a few fates that photon can take. The first one is photochemistry. The second one is non-photochemical quenching, which also goes by thermal energy dissipation. And that both these two can sort of, they tend to often co-vary. There are some non-linearities, but generally we can assume that when there's more photochemistry, there's less non-photochemical quenching, or less, there's more basically excess photons dissipated thermally as excess energy. And then the last fate that I'll talk about today is chlorophyll fluorescence, which is a small, tiny fraction of this energy. So while photochemistry and energy dissipation can fluctuate widely, chlorophyll fluorescence fluctuates on a much smaller scale and is about 0 to 3% of those absorbed photons. In the winter, everything changes. So we see a big change in pigments. So what we see is an increase in these pigments called the xanthophyll cycle. And the xanthophyll pool plays an important role in dissipating excess light as non-photochemical quenching. I like to think of it as plant sunscreen, right? So if a plant is stressed and it's like, hey, I can't absorb these photons right now, I just don't have it in me to do photosynthesis, I'm going to apply some more sunscreen. And effectively what that's doing is interconverting these xanthophyll cycle pigments, and it's dissipating excess light away from the plant. And that's primarily what's happening in the winter, despite the fact that chlorophyll is relatively constant. So we've been doing a lot of work collecting pigments at sites. And so this is pigment data over the course of a year from the NEON site in Delta Junction, Alaska. And when I say we, I mean the field technicians go out there and they collect needles for us. They put them in liquid nitrogen, ship them on dry ice, and then we process them for pigments. And what we can see at this site in Alaska is a dramatic change in these sunscreen pigments, or these xanthophyll cycle pigments in purple, where when we enter into the summer, we see a dramatic decrease and then an increase as fall ramps up again. Meanwhile, our chlorophyll concentration is quite flat. And then our ratio of chlorophylls to carotenoids also shows a bit of seasonality. The reason these pigments are important is because pigments are effectively what we can see from remote sensing, right? So based on small changes in the reflectance signature, we can actually infer how these pigments are moving around, and we can use this to better understand the seasonality. Right, so in the wintertime, we see this larger xanthophyll cycle pool, these sunscreen pigments. In the summertime, that pigment pool shrinks quite a bit. We see a big reduction. And then we can contrast this to a site in Florida, which is much warmer, does not freeze, and has not a huge seasonal cycle in water availability. And what we see there, and our units are a little different here, but the main take home is basically that this xanthophyll cycle pool and the chlorophyll concentration are relatively flat throughout the year. So when we we see pigment fluctuations throughout the year, and I'll talk about how we can scale those up in a second, but then we also see changes in actual photochemistry. So these are the processes that are happening before the carbon reactions of photosynthesis. And when we hook up instruments to needles and measure continuous fluorescence parameters, we see pretty strong covariation between something like the yield of fluorescence, or the fraction of photons that are being fluoresced, and the yield of photochemistry, the fraction of photons that are being used to ultimately drive photosynthesis. This is encouraging if we're wanting to use something like a solar-induced fluorescence signal to look at something like GPP, because it's telling us that at the needle scale, these two parameters are covariating pretty strongly in these systems. However, when we look a little deeper and we plot all of our data from our needle scale measurements throughout the year, and we look at the yield of fluorescence, so that fraction of photons going to drive fluorescence, and that fraction of photons going to drive photochemistry, we do see a bit of a nonlinearity emerge. But one of the arguments we made in this 2024 paper is that most of our remote sensing observations under low to moderate light intensities are actually falling within this green zone. And so despite the fact that we might see some nonlinearities between fluorescence and photochemical yield under very low light or extreme stress, most of our observations from remote sensing platforms fall under this collinearity. So now let's scale up these physiological mechanisms to the canopy. So I'm going to go back to this sort of conceptual figure here and break it down into a few of the parameters I just introduced, but photochemical yield in black, non-photochemical quenching or thermal energy dissipation in purple, and fluorescence yield in red. So if we think about this in sort of a mass balance equation, we can assume that for every photon absorbed, it's going to be equal to the sum of all three of these fates. And then if we break this down in a much more simplistic way, we can assume that at the canopy scale, gross primary productivity is equal to absorbed light by chlorophyll times the fraction of photons being used to drive photochemistry. But we can't directly measure photochemical efficiency or phi-p from remote sensing. So can we use proxies that can give us information on pigments or fluorescence to ultimately back out GPP using remote sensing variables? So if we look at our typical plant reflectance spectrum here, this is just some data from a site in Florida. Well, actually, this is in Colorado. The black line here is the reflectance spectrum in the winter. The green line is in the summer. If we look at something like NDVI, it's not going to change that much throughout the year. You can see very little difference between the winter and summer spectrum, but NDVI can give us some information on a parameter like absorbed light by chlorophyll. We can look at the photochemical reflectance index, which could tell us about dynamic dissipation of excess light. And that is sort of manifested by this chain right there at 532 nanometers. We can also look at longer term changes in pigments using something called the chlorophyll carotenoid index, which looks at differences between the red and the about 532 nanometers as well. And then finally, we can look at solar-induced fluorescence. So here's just a seasonal cycle at Niwot Ridge in Colorado, where we see GPP on the y-axis ramping up in the spring, wiggling around, and then decreasing in the fall. Our NDVI data from this site at the tower scale is flat throughout the year. And that is because it is retaining its chlorophyll and it is green throughout the year. If we look at something like the photochemical reflectance index, which looks at changes at 531 nanometers, we can see this sort of xanthophyll cycle interconversion happening dynamically right around when GPP starts, and then in the fall, a slower decrease in it. And we can also look at something like solar-induced fluorescence, which will give us information on the start and the end of photosynthesis, but also some of that within season variation. And then, of course, we validate all this with information that we've collected in the field throughout the year. So we're going to go back to these 4 sites, and I'm going to just show some data across all 4 sites. I'll try to speed up a little bit because of time. We use an instrument called PhotoSpec. This is an instrument we started building in about 2016, which measures hyperspectral reflectance and solar-induced fluorescence. It's a scanning telescope system. And across all 4 of these sites, I won't go into all this in detail, but the point is just that we see a lot of variation in temperature, light, and ultimately NE and GPP across all 4 of these sites. And at all 4 of these sites, had a bit of a lag. At all 4 of these sites, we have, this is just data from Colorado, Saskatchewan, and Alaska. The point I want to make is that these blue lines here is when there's snow on the ground. And effectively what you can see is that light intensity tends to ramp up in the spring well before GPP. but GPP does start in all these sites before the snow is actually melted, which complicates remote sensing measurements, as many of you know. If we then look at our solar-induced fluorescence data, we actually begin to see a little bit of a solar-induced fluorescence increase coincident with our increase in PAR prior to GPP. So it's not really capturing the spring onset as well as maybe we would have hoped. So how can we correct for that light-driven increase in SIF and this impact in snow? And what we've done with this paper that hopefully will come out soon is we're basically just using what's called a relative SIF. So we're taking SIF and we're dividing it by the reflected radiance within the retrieval window. And effectively what this does is normalizes it for just the light-driven increase in SIF. And what this is giving us is effectively a fluorescence yield. So then when we compare our needle scale fluorescence yield data, which is in purple, with SIF relative data from the tower in red, across a lot of our sites, we begin to see this really strong correspondence, which suggests that we can then use relative SIF to approximate fluorescence yield. And then finally, we can also do something like compare the light use efficiency of photosynthesis from the tower with PS2 yield at the needle scale, and we also see pretty reasonable correspondence. And then taken together, we can use SIF relative to estimate light use efficiency of photosynthesis at all three of these sites with pretty high accuracy. So sort of in conclusion here, correcting for SIF using this SIF relative approach better tracks the onset of GPP, and satellites haven't been able to do this yet because of the snow background impact. But now we've figured out a way to do it. And then ultimately this kind of confirms the sort of waking up of these ecosystems at a range of scales. And hopefully will help us get a better understanding on the timing of photosynthesis in evergreen needle-leaf forests. And there's some more, but I'll stop it there because of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Troy. Let's go for the second speaker for the science talk. We have Austin Chu. Austin is from Berkeley Lab, and he will talk about bridging the link between flux towers and models to enable upscaling.
Okay. Just give me a second to bring the screen up. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me in the next 10 minutes. I'm going to share something I've been doing, some exercise I've been doing in the last couple of years, especially thanks to all my collaborators, a lot of feedback, a lot of idea, inspiration, and also try to end the presentation with something maybe I don't have an answer yet, but I hope we can try to team up maybe to do something together through this workshop. I think that's idea here. So let's move on. So I try to summarize. A lot of people mentioned this already in today's earlier presentation about this mismatch between the flux tower footprint, but also the whatever model you prefer in your pocket, right? So on the left-hand side, we know the rich temporal information from the flux tower data. So left. And this is not new, but something being overlooked for a lot of people, less 10 years, 20 years, is a special information for this flux data, essentially. So looking at this is a flux footprint for every half hour. So it's kind of moving around. It's mentioned a couple of times today's talk already. It's not new. But if you overlap with nature, especially we know this not homogeneous everywhere. There's some information here. If you look at either a land cover type or maybe the different vegetation indices Troy just mentioned earlier, there are some heterogeneity. So essentially we need to rethink about flux data. It's not time series data alone, right? So this is a spatial temporal data we're dealing with, essentially. And when we try to match this data to any kind of model you have in mind, it's typically from the right-hand side, right? You assume something, a typical grid cell with some land cover type information there, maybe some vegetation indices there, and you try to model something within this grid cell. So this is a missing link between these two. It's been changing for a year. So this is one exercise I've been doing the last a few years ago. Is try to look at so what? So how heterogeneous the flux footprint actually across a flux size. So this is an exercise. Try to look at so what is the land cover type within the footprint, but also compare to let's say a certain area around the tower. Because if you look at any upscale study, typically people say, okay, let's assume flux tower represent the 3 kilometer around the tower, 1 kilometer, whatever you pick, and let's do upscaling because this is where everything coming from. So how likely the land cover type within the footprint compared to the land cover? And this is kind of ranking a different tile, right? So you have something like, okay, within a footprint, everything is very similar to, let's say this is 1 kilometer around the tower. We call this a high representativeness. And all the way to very heterogeneous cases, right? So if once you move away from the tower, the land cover type will be very different. And this is a kind of the overview for across the Merflux side. This is over 200 sites. So how many of them actually have something very similar to within a footprint? So you see the number decrease. It depends on the ecosystem type, but also decrease along once you move away from the tower. So the first thing. Second thing we look at is okay, let's say, how about EVI or some other vegetation indices? We're using EVI here in this case. We focus on the seasonal dynamic of the EVI within the footprint, but also certain target area around the tower, right? So look at how similar they are. Again, if you have something at the top, this is a very high representative, means whatever you see within a tower is very similar to, let's say, the target area, all the way to something very complicated cases like this at the bottom. They are very different. Again, so you see, it's not always representative of the area you try to target. So we think about this, and this is just one example showing what that means, right? So you have a one flux tower here, and this is an EVI, the time series of EVI within the footprint in a circle, of also different target area around the tower, right? So this is a forest and situated in a forest and the shrubland, grassland, landscape. So you have very different seasonal dynamic of the EVI, depends on the area cut off. If you have something this in your model, you try to model the dynamic in the tower, it'll be very challenging. So moving on, we know that issue there. So what can we do, right? So if you're a modeler coming from the right-hand side, you try to, let's say, can we do something to mimic what we see from the flux tower, right? So especially with a remote sensing being very fine, hyper spatial temporal resolution now these days. So that's a way it's possible you can try to model, if you're a remote sensing model person, you can model something within a very small pixel size, even smaller than the footprint, and try to mimic this. So this is an exercise I did a little bit. This is using Landsat Sentinel 30-meter resolution. So you try to model, pick a couple different, very simple model, 3 different models here, but try to model something within a very small scale, and to see if you consider the footprint of the tower, or if you treat everything equally, like a typical cutoff around the tower, how different they are. So this is a typical, this is a comparison between just a pure footprint effect. And across the Ameriflux side, this is we see even with different model, there are some bias, right? So if you ignore the footprint at all and try to use a fixed cutoff around all the tower and how much different they are, this is roughly 10 up to 12% bias, systematic bias across the site. And the bias actually very depends on ecosystem type. So land cover composition you see, right? So there are certain type of the land cover type, ecosystem type, they are pretty situated in a very fragmented landscape. So you tend to see this bias. And there are certain area like a dry land, some area, the bias might be not less prominent. And also depends on the region you're at. So this is just a small exercise to just sort of idea here and maybe something to consider. Another approach will be, okay, we are on flux tower person. Can we do something about flux data, right? Because can we have something that very convenient, just kind of debias this spatial variability within a footprint. And so something can be directly compared to a model at all. So this is kind of a different approach, right? Coming from flux tower data, can we try to do something like a decomposition? So the idea is very similar to flux partitioning we are doing in the past, right? So partition is partition different process. And now we're thinking about partition decomposition about different land cover type, a different plane functional type within the footprint. Can we do that? And there are actually, I won't say a lot. There are some paper, some research, including Stefan here, are doing some pioneer study about this. How can we do this and to make flux data more comparable to model? There are two case study I'm showing here. So one is a very simple case, right? So you have this is a grassland, California, and you have a small patch of the seasonal wetland. So in the wet season, everything's green, so you don't see a difference. But in the dry season, when everything dies, you see the wetland kind of behave very differently. So using a very simple approach like a partitioning by the wind direction, you'll be able to separate apart. You see on the right-hand side, can separate apart the flux and the response function very clearly. But moving to a more complicated cases like this one, this is a Mayberry wetland run by Dennis. You see, this is much more heterogeneous, right? Depends on the wind direction. You're seeing a mix of the marsh vegetation, upland vegetation, but some open water. This is more complicated, and so it failed. I don't show the result here, but there are potential way to try to improve this, right? So if you incorporate additional constraint, like a spatial information here, this is a planar scope, 3-meter product with data information about the vegetation indices here, and plus with the flux tower information, be able to tease apart some of the information here, right? So this is kind of the result. What you see based on the flux tower plus the remote sensing, and you have everything showing there, and you can tease apart the spatial structure, but also the temporal information of the flux coming from the flux data. So this is my last slide, this lesson learned, but also something I haven't been able to tackle. So a lot of things I mentioned earlier, footprint awareness. This is important. Whenever you use flux data, be aware this is not a fixed target area. So, and don't ever use a fixed target area to do upscaling again. We are in a better place right now, so we should do better. The second part will be, I don't have a solution yet. I saw a lot of research, especially at the site level, try to target this question, right? So we have a heterogeneous, we know the footprint we can run. Can we do something to separate part of the information here? I saw a lot of people proposing different approach. I just put on a list here. I don't think there's any cross-site synthesis large scale being done yet. I think that's something we need to do it together. Last thing is additional constraint. There are limited information provided by flux tower data alone. We are in a better places right now, whether we have a lot of remote sensing, other constraint can be used, and together we can do something much better. I'm going to close here. I hope this inspires some of your soul for tomorrow's workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Hosen. Our next speaker is Levente Klein from IBM. He will present his presentation titled Foundation Models for Vegetation Growth and Carbon Sequestration. Levente, you are on virtual. Stage is yours.
Please, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes. You need to go into presenting mode.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'll do that.
perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming from the New York region, so it's also very hot here, not only in the Sacramento, as was the first speaker. And so I want to present, our perspective about, how we are trying to use some of these flux tower measurements. And specifically, I'm coming from an AI/remote sensing background. So we are trying to take very large models and we are trying to calibrate it locally. So rather than going from point measurements to some of the regional scales, we are really trying to go all the way around. So just to give you a perspective, our interest here, it's really about quantifying some of the carbon that is sequestered in various nature-based solutions. And the team which I'm leading here, it's mainly focused about carbon sequestrations, mainly in vegetations or forestry. And so we try to do this one purely driven by as much as possible by satellite data and then local measurements where it's possible. And the objective is to really develop some of these global models to be as precise as possible. And then potentially once you have some of these global models, the idea would be that you could enable on a local scale to quantify what is going to be the overall carbon that is sequestered, let's say in a project. And do this one more accurately, or potentially, offer an alternative way of quantifying this one, let's say compared with what Vera has been presenting in the morning. And I'm going to go back to that one for towards the end of my presentations. But nevertheless, just a walk-away message from here is that we are trying to do this type of modeling based on ecoregions. And what we are observed that the uncertainty and the accuracy of some of these estimates of the overall carbon that is sequestered in vegetation, it's highly dependent on where you're measuring and how. So just as a takeaway message is that potentially the very data-rich regions, that it's mainly, let's say, the United States, we have a better model, right? And as we are moving out, let's say, to Africa or other parts of the world, where some of the local measurements are sparser, then the model starts to fail somehow. So the way that we are attacking a problem is that, it's really just developing some of these so-called AI models. And to give you a perspective here, it's going to be just a 1 minute, but, we have these evolutions of AI models, right? That it started in the 80s, where we started to have some of these expert systems. And after that, we start to develop some of the machine learning models. Random forest has been mentioned multiple times today. This is mainly of the 80s and 90s, where people tried to figure out, some type of features that you could craft manually using vegetation indices, etc. And some of these models turn out to be extremely robust. They are used even today, and they are providing some of the baseline that people have used. And so as we moved along, and more computations and more data became possible, right? We are talking about some of these deep learning models that has been carried out in the last decade. But one of the challenge there, it's really just the need to have